I am.
You went to college with my wife.
To those who are standing up, there are still a few seats up front. Welcome everyone. I'm Sheila Ben-Habib. So colleagues, students, and friends, before starting, we would like to acknowledge also the generous support of the Edward J. and Dorothy Clark Kemp Fund of Yale, the Macmillan Center for International Studies, the Institute for Social Policy Studies, and Yale's Political Science Department that made this conference possible. We would also like to thank our conference assistants, David Frumkin and Mie Inouye, for their tireless efforts. So again, welcome to all of you, and it's chilly and freezing out there, but no, it's not. In a much discussed article of August 14th, 2016, which I'm sure is known to a number of you in this audience, called "The Week Democracy Died," the Harvard political theorist Yascha Mounk wrote, I quote, "The centrifugal forces that are threatening to break apart political systems across the world may have started to register a decade ago. They may have picked up speed over the last 12 months, but never since the fall of the Berlin Wall have they wreaked havoc in so many places in so short a span of time, showcasing the failures of technocratic rule, the terrifying rise of populist strongmen, and the existential threat posed by Islamist terrorism, all in a span of short 7 days," end of quote. What led Mounk to these alarmist declarations was that on June 23, 2016, the British people had voted to leave the European Union. On July 14th, during Bastille celebrations, ISIS terrorists attacked crowds in Nice, resulting in the death of 86 people and injuring 458 others. The next day, a military coup planned by military officers against President Recep Tayyip Erdogan unfolded in Turkey. Called to action by the president and from the minarets of the mosques, Turks came, quote-unquote, to defend democracy. The plotters were condemned by all political groups and parties, but the repression which ensued this coup sounded the death knell rather than the defense of democracy in Turkey. Add to these events unfolding within the span of a week, the election of Donald Trump a year ago, the rise of Marine Le Pen in France, the entry of the Alternative für Deutschland party to the German parliament with 13% of the vote, and the popularity of Geert Wilders in the Netherlands, all representatives of a nativist, racist, anti-immigrant, and white nationalist trend, and Mounk's conclusion, quote, that liberal democracy is decomposing into its constitutive parts. Over the next decades, much of the world will face a tragic choice between illiberal democracy or democracy without rights and undemocratic liberalism, or rights without democracy seemed quite plausible. In the year and a half since Mounk made those predictions, clarion calls about, quote, the death of democracy, the eclipse of democracy, the rise of populism or illiberal democracies, post-democracy, etc., have increased. This terminological confusion and contention is itself indicative of the as yet unsettled and confusing nature of the phenomena we are facing. In Greek, crisis means a crucial turning point in the progression or evolution of a phenomenon, a disease, let us say. Crisis is when the patient can take a turn either for the best or for the worst. Cremain also refers to the judgment that is passed at such a turning point. So crisis involves both identifying a state of affairs and also passing critical, correct judgment on it. While there is some consensus among the participants of this conference that we are at some kind of a turning point in the development of democracies. There is much less consensus among you about which set of institutions, practices, or behavior are to be singled out as most important in enabling us to identify the nature of the crises or even offer solutions to them. Are we experiencing a process of slow metamorphosis of liberal democracies into creeping authoritarianism, as Levitsky and Zevlad claim in their newly released book? Or is it to be hoped that this turning point may also permit the emergence of new, counter-hegemonic and experimental alternatives to the conventional model of liberal democracy as Yves Saint-Amand proposes? Some among you point to the decline of mass parties in advanced democracies, furthered by their illusion of enabling more direct participation via referenda, plebiscites, local party commissions, and the like. This has only led to the rise of right-wing populism and voter fragmentation, argue Shapiro and Rosenbluth. Other contributions see the election of Donald Trump as signaling the end of folk theories of democracy, according to which a well-informed citizenry would convey coherent collective judgments concerning discourse of public policy. They do not, argue Achen and Bartels. Another common theme running through much of the democratic crisis literature, as well as many of the conference papers, is the uncoupling of liberalism and democracy. This uncoupling is manifest in the rise of extreme inequalities, which jeopardizes the belief that a liberal democratic regime, in Jeff Green's words, quote, can afford equal respect to all its citizens, conceived as equal and free co-legislators in public affairs. Indeed, we seem to be caught between plutocracy and populism. But in liberal democracy, a term first suggested by Farid Zakaria a decade ago, are also characterized by much deeper institutional transformations, such as the decline of the rule of law and human rights via increasing governmental control over the judiciary and court packing, the intimidation, harassment, and even imprisonment of oppositional politicians and parliamentarians, restrictions on the rights of assembly, state control of the media and the internet, the crushing of civil society through intimidation, imprisonment, illegal confiscation of property, and the rise of demagogic and populist leaders or strongmen who claim to represent the people as such. Such illiberal regimes extend from Hungary to the Philippines, from Turkey to Venezuela, from Singapore to Russia. When is the point reached, asks Achen in her contribution about populism in Turkey, at which we realize that democracies undermine themselves by permitting anti-democratic and even fascist regimes to emerge from amongst their midst? Is it not a little too rosy to call these regimes that have historically been neither particularly liberal nor democratic, illiberal democracies? Maybe we are on a slippery slope towards some form of 21st century fascism without mass mobilization. A few more points and then I'll conclude. The crisis of the project of liberal democracy suggests that the West, if you will permit me to use that amorphous term only once, has no business in dictating to others how they should live their lives and organize their societies. With the crisis at the center, the capacity as well as the possibility of liberal democracy to impose itself upon the periphery declines. So, Rahul Sagar asks, have you been to Kazakhstan? Reviving John Rawls's discussion of decent hierarchical societies in the law of peoples and proposing the conception of decent regimes, Rahul Sagar recommends to us both humility and political diffidence to those who believe in particular that there is a universalizable core of liberal democracy. Better to learn tolerance and practice coexistence than engage in regime change. But decent hierarchical societies and regimes are not just out there, somewhere else, in some extra-lunar space. We coexist in space and time with each other, and we also coexist with their citizens and residents, whether it is because they have escaped oppression or because they seek economic opportunities. They are our neighbors in New Haven, in New York, in London, in Mexico City, in Paris, in Sydney, etc. The peoples of Kazakhstan are on the move, and the world's largest migratory movements are occurring from the global south to the global north, at least for those who succeed in crossing seas and oceans and facing the unbarbed wires and police blocks. Migratory movements, whether undertaken for economic reasons, to escape persecution and civil wars, to seek refuge and asylum, have become one of the most vexing issues for all liberal democracies. But today, where are the boundaries of the demos? To redefine the demos, must we build new Chinese walls? Who is the citizen and who is the stranger, the other? How can we unscramble the people? Do we even want to? In his contribution to our very first panel this afternoon, Phillip Thompson reminds us that racial discrimination, hierarchy, and division run through the history of the American Republic. As he notes, quote, "The post-war social welfare state is racialized, in that it excluded and oppressed African Americans as well as Mexican and Chicanos, both formally and informally. And as Diana Mutz will point out in her contribution, the lines between the inside and the outside, strangers and foreigners, are today increasingly blurred. This blurring of boundaries then poses a challenge to democratic theory and practice, and gives rise to another problem, and this is the last one that Achen mentioned, and the problem of scale, the scale of democracy. As Rainer Bauberg and John King both note, contemporary changes brought about by globalization and new digital technologies, which in turn enable the spread of financial capitalism on a global scale, have unbundled liberal democratic citizenship into many different fragments. Is the danger, asks Bauberg, then the emergence of new forms of uncivil conflict and violence? But aren't new forms of civility and cosmopolitanism also possible through the coexistence of strangers in the new global cities of the world? Maybe the solidarity of strangers can only be practiced at the sub-national and supranational levels. To conclude, we've come together not only to talk about the crisis of democracy, such as they are named, but also to discuss and envisage some alternatives. As Helene Landemore, to whom I also thank for having brought me into this conference about a year ago, and I will now give her the podium, but as Helene Landemore puts it, the challenge before us is, how can we still imagine new forms of self-government, people's rule in the 21st century? So I wish everyone a happy conference and much discussion.
Welcome everyone. It's a treat to be able to gather such great minds over the course of 2 days at Yale. So I really thank you from the bottom of my heart for making the trip to New Haven and being willing to share your insights about this topic of great concern to all of us. So Sheila just gave a wonderfully rich panorama of the problems that motivated this conference and some of the very diverse perspectives that we have brought together on this question of the crisis of democracy. In my introductory remarks, I'd like to motivate a little further this gathering and what we are trying to explain, what we are trying to accomplish with it. So in the last few years, and especially since the results of the presidential elections, there have been a number of conferences organized around the US at various top universities about the crisis of democracy. And in fact, just a few months ago here at Yale, our very own Susan Stokes organized a conference on how do democracies fall apart and could it happen here. This conference also started, like ours, from the premise that there is a kind of malaise or crisis going on, and that we may be at a critical juncture in terms of liberal democracy's viability as a regime, both in the US and generally in the West. I attended most of that conference, which was wonderful, but I have to tell you, the tone and conclusions were rather somber. With this conference, we are trying to continue this conversation, and from a normative perspective and from a perspective that's oriented towards solutions. So I see it as a complementary sort of project. We're trying to go beyond the causal diagnostic of what went wrong, or what is wrong with democracy, as we know it, by asking a series of conceptual questions about the various terms in the phrase, the crisis of democracy. And in fact, we could have added a question mark at the end of this phrase. So first, what do we mean by democracy? Do we mean liberal democracy or liberalism? Do we mean democracy or representation? Do we mean the set of institutions we are familiar with at the level of the nation state? That is the reality of existing democratic regimes characterized by party competition, periodic elections? Or do we mean the crisis of the normative ideal behind this institution? The ideal of demos kratos, people's power, popular rule. These distinctions are important because while one may agree that democracies as they exist are in crisis, some would argue that they have long ceased to be democratic, if they ever were, one could consistently argue that the ideal of democracy as popular rule, by contrast, is alive and well, though it may be losing ground today due to the flaws in its empirical embodiment. If we now mean by democracy the normative ideal of people's power, of popular rule, what should we understand by this beyond the general idea of rule of, by, and for the people? Is it the folk theory of popular rule as popular control? Is it democracy as elite competition, Schumpeterian version? And is our normative ideal of democracy aggregative or deliberative? Is it direct or representative? I think a lot of these assumptions are often taken for granted, and we want in this conference to reopen these questions. The term crisis now opens up a different kind of questions. So Sheila mentioned that the term itself refers both to a process, a state of affair, and a judgment passed about this state of affair. One could first ask whether there is a crisis at all, or whether the agitation and convulsions we seem to observe today are in fact the normal state of affairs for an intrinsically unstable or disorderly regime form, a regime form which may actually thrive on disorder and agitation, and find in them the resilience it needs to face large-scale changes brought by, among other things, globalization and technological change. That's one viewpoint worth considering. Another question is, assuming there is indeed a crisis, at what temporal scale are we looking at it? Did the crisis start in 2016, 2008, sometimes in the 70s, or even earlier? When a crisis has been going on for so long, if we assume it dates back to that far, can we still call it a crisis? Is it not instead a chronic disease if it's not a normal state of affairs? And if it's a chronic disease, how much longer can democracy live with it? We will also ask whether there are maybe multiple democratic crises of different kinds, which should be carefully distinguished because they don't call for the same kind of solutions. If so, what are the respective symptoms and causes? What are the most salient dimensions? Economic, political, racial, technological, ethical, all of the above? How do we disentangle manifestations and effects from underlying root causes? How do we dissociate between the symptoms and the actual causes? for any diagnostic of the causes behind the crisis of democracy, how do we additionally distinguish between causes that are contingent to recent historical shifts, say the orthogonal forces of, again, globalization, crisis of capitalism, or technological change, and causes that may well be intrinsic to democracy's institutions and current design, at least the current design that we've inherited from 18th century choices, more or less. For example, does the role of elections and party competition not generate the kind of disconnect between elites and masses, or the political polarization between ideological camps we deplore today? And if so, how much good is it going to do to focus on tweaking at the margin certain problems like the role of money in politics? Finally, the goal of the conference will also be to point and work towards solutions. These solutions may first take the form of conceptual or paradigmatic shifts, or straightforward institutional reform proposals. Some of these solutions might involve constitutional changes. Some of them might involve changing how we see the scope and domain of democratic politics. So we will talk about things like introducing a randomly selected chamber of the people in the system. We will talk about expanding the domain of democracy to the economic sphere, or the bicameral firm, for example. We are going to talk about citizens' initiatives, about ways to make democracy more radical or more direct, as opposed to just representative in better ways. Generally, some of these solutions might involve changing our expectations about what democracy is and can do. So to conclude, I'm happy to announce that our goal beyond the conference is to publish an edited volume, edited by Professor Ben-Habib and myself, based on your contributions to this conference, hopefully revised in light of the conversations we're going to have over the next 2 days. So the most important thing that needs to happen over the next 2 days is a constructive exchange of views, not only between the speakers, but between the speakers and the public, which is an essential part of this conversation. And so we're asking you to open your minds and see these conversations as a starting point rather than a conclusion. So with this, let me thank you again for being here. Special note of thanks to David Fromkin and Mie Inouye, because they really did an amazing job behind the scene. And finally, let me mention that we lost one of our speakers, Jeffrey Isaac, who was supposed to be here on the first panel to a head concussion.
He's okay, he's okay.
He's fine, but he's
he can't
not
fly.
in shape to travel. So he will be sorely missed, especially as he was scheduled to open the first panel. Luckily, Yves Saint-Omer has agreed to step in instead, and which has also the advantage of making the last session a bit lighter. So work that. So we have a terrific lineup, and we should get started. So I'm going to hand it over to Christophe.
Hello, folks. I think in the interest of saving time, I'm not going to be going back and forth to the podium. I'm just going to speak to you from here. I'm Sue Stokes. I'm a political science professor here at Yale. I am a founding member of Bright Line Watch, which is an organization between University of Rochester, Yale, and Dartmouth of mostly comparative politics faculty who have been concerned about potential threats to democracy in the United States and in other parts of the world. I'm also the director of the Yale Program on Democracy, which tries to sort of build a bridge between political theory and empirical studies of politics. I'm very happy to have been invited to this conference. I'm very grateful to Hélène and to Shayla for organizing it. And I am serving as chair of this panel, and this is our first panel entitled the Crisis of Democracy. And we will go in order of the program. We are giving our panelists 12 minutes each for presentation, so I'll also try to be timekeeper. Our first panelist is Yves Saint-Omer. with apologies to pronunciation. He is a professor of political science at Paris 8 University and a member of the Bureau, which is the President's Advisory Council of this university. He is an honorary senior fellow at the French University Institute. He has been a visiting scholar at many universities. Happily for us, he's a visiting scholar at Yale University this semester. And he has written broadly on democratic theory and politics. His publications include Between Radical and Deliberative Democracy, Random Selection in Politics from Athens to Contemporary Experiments, and a number of other publications. So without further ado, Yves.
Thank you very much, Hélène and Sheila, for this invitation, for this possibility to discuss with you today and tomorrow. I would make 4 claims. The first one is that the crisis of democracy is huge and is structural. It's not business as usual, and we have to face it. The second claim is that the political theory has to learn from global history. I think our colleagues in history have made a turn that we should make as political theorists. And especially, I would like to stress that the Western democratic model had always and still have 2 faces, a dark one and a bright one that we have to take into account. The third claim is that we have to develop a new democratic theory for this century. And the last claim is that business as usual, the status quo is an option, and I think that there are 3 realistic scenarios for the future: post-democracy, authoritarianism, and democratization of democracy. The problem is the PowerPoint. Why is this crisis structural? Look at the evolution of political trust in the US. In most European countries, this would be the same, and the level of trust is even lower in most of new democracy. Look at the income inequalities, which are rising. Piketty has demonstrated that quite beautifully, and this is also a trend which is not specific to the US, although the strength of the growth of inequalities is special in the US and in England. Even factors like the life expectancy, there is no precedent. 2 years of a drop of life expectancy in the US means something about the society in which you live with it. In Europe, it's not that much better. Look at Germany, the country in which mass political parties were invented in Europe at the end of the 19th century. Since the 1990, both Christian Democrats and Social Democrats have lost half of their membership. And if you put together the 50 most important European political parties, the trend is similar, more or less according to the country, to the party. I mean, in this century, in a few years, we'll experience something quite new. The most important economy will be an economy led by some kind of authoritarian regime and not by an Occidental or Western democracy. I think that altogether we have these signals, and we'll speak a lot about them. It's not just a difficulty for some years. I think that we face a lot of different crises which are analytically independent, but which have effects which overlap, cumulative effects. The crisis of the welfare state democracy, but also of the liberal democracy. Both models are in crisis, and there is no credible alternative at the moment. The ecological crisis, which will be a major topic in this century. The crisis of the post-colonial or imperial order, we in Europe or in the US have to find another identity. We have to accept to be only part of the world and not at the center of the world, and this is very difficult for countries which used to be at the core of the empire. The crisis of the national sovereign state is also very important, and it is perhaps less important in the US, but the margin of action of a country like Greece, for example, is really much reduced today. Look also at the social acceleration of changes. Think about the difference of socialization between the young people now with internet and social networks, the difference with 2 generations ago. Society is incredibly changing, and the political system more or less has remained the same, and the gap between the evolution of society and the political system is widening. In addition, there is a specific political factor, which is the crisis of the political parties, which were at the core of our competitive party democracy, but which made also possible for the working class to have a voice in the polity. And I think that this vanishing of mass political parties is particularly difficult. Doesn't work anymore. Yes. We all know now that the end of history was very naive, and I don't develop this. But what we do not recognize enough is that a large part of the philosophy of history, which was behind Fukuyama's diagnosis about the end of history, is shared by most political theorists. Namely, the idea that we in the West, the global North, are the front runner in one historical path which is unique. We underestimate connections, hybrids, and inventions in the global South. We underestimate also the fact that there have been a lot of paths to modernity, and the political theory remains mostly focused on the experience of Western democracies, especially after World War II, and the greatest political theorists have relied heavily on this particular historical experience. And what is missing in this picture is the fact that this history has been a history with two faces. One bright faces for the insiders, and a dark face for those who were not insiders. I will only give one example. Take the emission of CO2 accumulated. This is the right figure. I mean, the USA and Europe have produced much more than their share in the population. If you compare Africa and USA, you can understand that the US way of life, the American way of life, was not universally available, and it was closely linked to the US democracy. In a new world, where we want to have a theory which takes into account global justice, and a theory of democracy which is not only for the happy few, we shall think something different. I will take only one example of this. Takes a classical check and balance theory. It was conceived by the founding fathers in order to limit democracy in the name of rights, in the name of protection of minority, in the name also of the rule of the wisest people. I do not say that this theory of check and balance has nothing more to tell us, especially at the age of Trump, but I think that we have to think much more broadly about what the check and balance could be in our world. I think that if we try to understand what is global governance, we have to think it in another way. This is a picture of a social network. And I think that global governance looks like this. You have a social network at the middle with American government, the Chinese government, the World Bank, Facebook, and Apple and Alibaba. A bit more in the margin with the French government, you have less important corporations, you have perhaps the Greenpeace, and then etc., etc. I think that the new check and balance for the new political theory of democracy in this century should take this into account. Robert Dahl in Yale, in Who Governs, was perhaps the first to put such a new way of thinking on the table, but I think that we have to develop this much more. Now, what are the scenarios for the future? I think that most of the, I don't know in the US, but that's at least in Europe, most of the political class, most of the journalists, and most of the political scientists remain functioning with business as usual, the way in which democracy has been conceived in the last 5-6 decades. And I think that this is not an option. We are over. This is over. This period is over. The return back to the classical national government, mass political parties is made non-realistic. The open domination of technocracy is not realistic. Technocracy is very important, but cannot rule directly. And the collapse or the end of representation is, I guess, not realistic options in our world, in the global north. I think that the three realistic options are the following. The first is what Colin Crouch has called post-democracy, namely rule of law, free competitive elections, separation of power, but this is a facade, and real decision-making takes place on closed door, behind the political official scene. And I think that this is the strongest tendency that we see in Western Europe, for example, at the time being, as Wolfgang Schäuble, the German Minister of Finance, told the Greek delegation when there was discussion about the debt in Greece, an election can't change anything. The second scenario, which is very often called illiberal democracy, but I think I prefer to call it authoritarianism, is a scenario which is very credible. We see this going on in a lot of countries, and for example in Eastern Asia, this is a scenario which is more or less stable. I mean, the Chinese government is doing good things with a very authoritarian way of doing it. The last scenario is a democratization of democracy. I think that we face this as a possibility, but we have to take into account the importance that should be given to the changes if we want to face the new and huge challenges of this century. We have to change things at a level comparable to the invention of mass political parties, to the creation of the welfare state, to the invention of direct democratic way of making politics, which were invented at the end of the 19th century or at the beginning of the 20th century. There are a lot of experiments going on, but I think that these experiments go and should go much beyond our actual institutional system if we really want to avoid both post-democracy and authoritarianism. These experiments take place both in the global north and in the global south. Probably in China, for example, it is more realistic to think that a new kind of democracy could be developed than just to think that the import of the Western political system, which doesn't function well in the USA or Europe, could solve the problem of China and make it possible to democratize this huge country. So I think that even it's not the most probable scenario, it's worth working on it, and it's a kind of real utopia because a lot of experiments are actually taking place which go in this direction. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Chris Achen. Chris is professor of politics in the politics department at Princeton University, where he holds the Roger Williams Strauss Chair in Social Science. His primary research interests are in public policy, elections, and the realities of democratic politics as he sees them. He has, along with statistical challenges that arise from those fields. He is the author of many articles and books. He most recently co-authored with Larry Bartels the very striking and widely read Democracy for Realists, and he is going to talk to us about ideas that come out of that project. Chris.
Thank you so much, Sue. Great. And how do I get it to advance? To the right. Okay, great. Thank you so much. I was a graduate student here in the late Middle Ages, and it's always a pleasure to be back, and I was honored to be asked. When I was asked, Helen said that my viewpoint would provide a certain contrast to that of most of the other speakers. I think she meant I'd be the skunk at the party. But there's perhaps something to be said even for skunks, and I'll try to play that role. I don't know as many of you as I usually do at academic conferences. I'm not a theorist. I'm an empirical person, someone who studies voters and elections and so forth. And so I want to try to bring some of what we've learned over the last half century to this conversation. And I think my goal is to give you a sense of how we think, how people who do what I do think. You will get a sophisticated version of all this tomorrow from Diana Mutz, but I'll be the warm-up act for today, and provide what I think is a kind of empirical foundation for thinking about where we should go next. One of the reasons I was happy to be invited is that Gabriel Almond, of course, well-known political scientist, said in his APSA presidential address that theorists and the rest of us too often inhabit separate tables. He was referring to the 1958 movie with, Rita Hayworth is the person I remember most from that movie, it's a film about people who have been divorced but are trying to get back together. And I think that might be a metaphor for inviting somebody like me, an empirical person, to a conversation of this kind, and do what I can to help reconstruct the relationship. So my view of populist crises is that we're seeing around the world right now is that they do not represent anything very new. That there has been a great deal of that throughout the history of democracies, that Plato talked about this problem, for example. There was a lot of it in Latin America in the 60s and 70s, and it's getting attention now because it's striking larger countries that are English-speaking and prominent in the world and so forth. But the phenomenon itself is not new. And it comes, I think, from a central fact about human beings, and it's that one that I want to emphasize today. And that central fact is that we people have a natural talent for seeing politics in terms of groups and group competition. We don't need much training to do that. We don't need much training to love our own group. We don't need much training to dislike outgroups. As Stokely, the result of that is that there's always group antagonism, and has been in every country since history began, and certainly in this one, and democracies don't abolish that. So as Stokely Carmichael once said, racism is as American as apple pie. And it's that basis that from which one has to begin, I think. By contrast, people's talent for acquiring factual information, for desiring to attempt to acquire factual information, for their sensitivity to other people's views, their ability to do moral reasoning, those are all pretty limited. And people hear cues about some of this, and they use them to blow their feet off. So this may sound a little skeptical, or may sound like your last department meeting, as the case may be. But my point here is not that there is some set of unfortunates out there who are less good at this than wonderful people like ourselves. It's that we're all subject to this kind of thing. We're all human, and we all have substantial limitations. And so the result of that then is that democracy is, the workings of democracy are going to reflect this, what we found out about people. So in terms of Melissa Schwartzberg's paper at this conference, there's a kind of relational equality between us, perhaps not the kind she had in mind, but it's an equality nevertheless. And it's an equality in this that we all have problems. So I don't have time today, by the nature of this conference, to go through all the evidence that's accumulated for this. Larry Bartels and I have discussed all that in the book that Sue mentioned, and I refer you to this if I sound like I'm skimming over things with no factual basis. There is plenty of factual basis for this. So what happened in this country in 2016 in particular? There were some small effects. And these small effects have gotten a tremendous amount of media attention. So one of those small effects is that white people with no college degree, sometimes referred to as working class, although they were mostly quite far from that, they were more likely than usual to vote for Trump. Less noted, but also true and seems to have been about the same size, is that white women with a college degree were less likely than usual to vote for Trump. That is to say, there were some defections. I've got two students working on the undergrads who are excited about this and working on it. I don't have as much detail as I'd like to have yet, but they're on the job. Now, as I say, these effects turn out to be relatively small. Now, you might say to me, come on, Chris, this stuff isn't small. Race makes a big difference. So let me show you some evidence that you haven't seen. We've all seen the surveys. This is something else from a little state located to the south of us here, where I live, namely New Jersey. This is the difference between the Obama vote and the Gore vote by, that is to say, their vote percentages, by New Jersey township. So each dot is a New Jersey township, and we've thrown out the ones that have fewer than 100 voters. You might ask, how can there be a township with fewer than 100 voters? They are tax scams of various kinds. I'll pass over that. So this plot shows the gain that Obama made relative to Gore as a function of the percent college graduates in these townships. And as you can see, it slopes upward. That is to say, the places with more college grads were more likely to vote for Obama. People with fewer college grads, the kind of people that are being talked about as Trump voters, were more inclined to abandon Trump and to abandon Obama and vote less for Obama than they had for Gore. In other words, these are the people on the left here are those towns are the places where we have the Trump voters. And these effects are not small. So a lot of these places are dropping by 10 percentage points. That's a big number in election studies. People like Franklin Roosevelt in 1932 only gained about 12 percentage points nationwide in the midst of the Depression. So this is a big change. Most people just vote the way they did last time. This looks substantial. So does that mean that I'm wrong? That in fact these effects are pretty large and that my skipping over them is a kind of a blunder? Well, here's the same kind of plot, but this is Obama versus Kerry this time. So Kerry, remember, is the 2004 candidate. So he is the immediately preceding Democratic candidate. Those of you from other countries, Kerry was a Massachusetts senator, a kind of Tony Upscale type guy who went windsurfing in the middle of the campaign. He bragged about the fact that when he was here as an undergrad, he never went to any poli-sci classes, and his campaign reflected that.
Also Vietnam hero.
His opponent had also been a Yale undergrad and made the same remark, and his foreign policy reflected that. In any case, what you see here is that there's no difference, right? There's no difference. In other words, we're comparing here a black candidate against a white candidate, and there's nothing going on. Whatever had happened had already happened by the year 2004, and it had come from white candidates. So here's Kerry versus Gore, and again you get the same upward slope. So there's something about the shift from the Clinton years to the later years that has made less educated white people abandon the Democratic Party. And you can see this in overtime polling data. They have started to go away. They started to go away as soon as Bill Clinton left office. They liked Bill Clinton, and since then they've liked Democratic candidates less and less. So the Trump effect, in other words, has been coming for quite a while, and it's not all Trump. Trump himself, I'm sure, made some difference. I don't have these data for the 2016 election. I had a choice between getting my grades in and making that graph, and I had to do what I'm paid to do. But I'm convinced that these differences are probably pretty small. The big effect in 2016 was that Republicans stood by. 90% of Republicans voted for Trump. And this is, you get 90% even if you ask people in 2011 what party they belong to. So this is not people deciding that they're Republicans because they're for Trump. There's some long run data that John Sides and Lynn Babbitt have accumulated. And this is about the same as Romney and McCain. They got about 90% of the Republican vote also. Trump just looked like an ordinary Republican to people. There were some small effects, as I just mentioned, but those effects largely canceled. That is to say, the shift of white educated women in one direction and less educated white men in the other. And the big effect was people voted their party. So here is 2016 data. This is a plot of the vote by House district, congressional district, 2012 versus 2016, and you can see that there's very little going on. It was, in the minds of most voters, an ordinary election. All of the weirdnesses about Trump, all of the threats to constitutional democracy, all of his insulting remarks to various categories of people, all his violations of ordinary civility went right over the heads of the voters. They heard it, they didn't care. Right? They were going to get a tax cut, they were going to get a Supreme Court appointment that was anti-abortion, they were going to have white people defended, and that's all they cared about. So this is what elections look like. Not just in 2016, but in other times as well. If you know how well the economy's been doing and take into account how long the incumbent party's been in office, this is what you get. You can predict the vote outcome pretty well knowing just those two things. How long have the current bums been in, and what's the state of the economy? The rest of the stuff tends not to be very influential with the voters. They're not paying attention. You might say, well, what was the forecast in 2016 from these dim-witted models? The answer is that the Democrats would win the popular vote by 2 percentage points. Clinton won the popular vote by 2.1 percentage points and lost because of bad luck in 3 states with a total of 77,000 votes. So the fact that Trump was repudiated by all the relevant members of his party just didn't make any difference. People just didn't respond to that. So what do people do in elections? They mostly vote for their party unless some group to which they belong has gotten a signal that it's no longer welcome in the party. And then they take into account the state of the economy. And that's what always happens. So populist demagogues are always possible. And we've had them a lot, right? We've had George Wallace. We've had Huey Long. We've had the populists in the 19th century, and so on. These are all a kind of standard feature of American democracy. It just kind of got worse lately, and there are things to talk about why that might have happened. But the basic message here is that this is an endemic feature of democracies, not something special that's happened lately. The folk theory of democracy, as Larry and I call it, is the idea that the voters have opinions, that they look for people who agree with them on those issues, they elect them, and the result is representative government. And that is a view that Rousseau expressed nicely. And it just doesn't work. And we've known that for a long time. And the last 50 years of social science have been pretty persuasive about that. But we keep trying to build theories of democracy that still use that basic notion of what people are like and voters are like. And as Walter Lippmann put it, that's like telling a fat man that he ought to be a ballet dancer. So what do I infer from this? There are lots of things to say here. I hope we'll have a good conversation. But I think the main point is that notions of democracy that intend to incorporate very directly what individual people want are not a good idea. When you do that, you get racists, you get confused people, you get people who want to kill the Jews, and so on and so forth. We need filters, and Francis and Ian will talk about that in just a little bit. What I want to flag for those of you here who are much more knowledgeable about political theory than I am, is to what degree we still live inside the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment notion that we can escape from being told how to think, we can escape from royal absolutism, that people are basically good but just corrupted by institutions, that people are perfectible, that education is the main way of making them better. Boy, does that sound good to professors, right? And we are like the Trump people. They get contrary evidence to their opinions. They don't listen. We get contrary evidence to our Enlightenment-derived notions, and we find it pretty hard to listen to. So I think my job here is to be the skunk and to ask people to cope with what I call the Kantian critique. Not the critique of pure reason and not the critique of practical reason, but his critique of ordinary people. And ordinary people includes us. He said, from such crooked timber as human beings are made of, nothing can be sawed quite straight. I think it's remembering that is fundamental to thinking about democratic reform. Thank you.
Chris, next up we have Phil Thompson. Phil is Associate Professor of Urban Planning and Politics at MIT. He also heads the Health Working Group at the School of Architecture and Planning and Media Lab at MIT. Phil's research focuses on Black politics, community development, and political economy. Outside of campus, he works with labor unions, community groups, and local government officials on strategies and policies for economic and social justice. He earned his PhD in political science from the City University of New York Graduate Center, a master's degree in urban planning from Hunter College in New York, and a BA in sociology from Harvard University.
Can I close it?
If you don't mind, we'll keep this up just because it records the session.
Oh. Okay. Until yesterday, I was in the Amazon in southern Colombia. And just to go to Eve's point, there were some shocking things there. I was working with, meeting with a tribe called Inca, the Inca, northernmost Inca people, who were displaced by the Civil War and then wiped out by an avalanche earlier this year. Their community and they were forced to move twice because of that. And they were on privately owned property, and they were told, well, you have to buy it for $1.2 million. And they said, wait a minute. We were here for many thousands of years. You came and took our land. We don't even practice your money economy. We don't believe in it. We live from the forest. And now you're telling us we have to buy the land we've been on for thousands of years. So that was like an interesting conversation. And then another was with the Army general who commands the Amazonian region for the Colombian government, and that's the majority of the country. And he is retraining the Army as an environmental force. So they are using helicopters bought with US money to drop bombs, but the bombs are actually biodegradable material that have tree seedlings in them. And I'm not even sure the American military realizes that's what they're doing. And all of the soldiers are being required to take courses in environmental conservation, forest management, etc. And he is also trying to create jobs for people who burn the forest for money, grow cocaine and other things. He's trying to create an entirely new kind of army that's really about environment and peacemaking in the deepest. I did not expect that. And I wondered what was going on when they sent an army plane to take me and 11 students from Bogota into the Amazon. That was the beginning of the weirdness. But I'm just saying that what is emerging, we don't know yet. And I think, we need to be a little bit curious and a little bit humble about that. In the paper I wrote, I tried to use 3 angles to describe this moment. I call them substrates. One was what I consider the collapse of neoliberal economics. And neoclassical neoliberal economics is, to my mind, very ideological and shockingly narrow-minded. It rejects Marx's understanding of how the introduction of technology has a tendency to slow down economies because it displaces labor, and how competitive pressures give rise to that. It rejects Keynes's understanding that on the importance of state government redistribution to counter the tendencies that Marx was talking about, rejects that. Rejects Herman Minsky's understanding that when you have very unequal distribution and rich people have way too much money, you can only, John Kerry has 14 houses, but there's a limit to how many houses you can live in. Romney has 11 houses. There's a limit to how many cars you can drive. There's a limit to how much. When wealthy people have too much money, they use it for speculation, and that asset inflation is inevitable. And when you have that happen, crashes are inevitable. So neoliberal economics rejects that sort of body of knowledge. It rejects Karl Polanyi, who said, left alone, capitalism has no self-limits and will make the lives of working people unbearable, as financialization is doing now. And someone else mentioned that. I read somewhere a study that showed that financiers can make as much money from a poor mother who is relying on, credit cards to day-to-day survival and going deep in debt in every way imaginable, as they can from a unionized auto worker. And the financial system has really perfected ways to squeeze money out of everybody. But it makes life very difficult for poor folks. So the point of this section was to basically say, and I was focused on the US, but people want change. Working people want change desperately. And I'll include in that white workers in Alabama, who I've spoken before recently. And I also work with the black folks in Alabama who worked hard and won this recent victory in the Senate race. And they themselves are actually trying to recreate the Democratic Party in Alabama. They do not want it to be a black party. They want it to include poor whites, and they think there is fertile ground for doing that right now because of the kind of pain people are in. And all around the world, you know, neoliberal economics is really exhausted as a model. It just hasn't delivered for folks. Most folks feel their lives, they're either stagnant or they're sinking. Second point I put in my comments in the paper was that it was about race and racial division, and I really agree with what Chris Achen said and also what Eve said. It's fundamental. I mentioned W.B. Du Bois's classic book, Black Reconstruction, in which he made the argument that capitalism created not one proletariat, but two. One white, one colored. Slavery was not pre-capitalist. African slavery was not pre-capitalist. It was actually a foundation of capitalism. The cotton industry was the first industry in which other, capitalism emerged from. It was all about slavery, all about colonialism. And Marx's work, and Engels' work based on Manchester doesn't actually reflect the scope of what capitalism was. And that still tends to be very popular in the American left, at least. The real issue is class, and workers are all in the same boat. And, no, they're not. White workers always had something to lose in America. They could become blacks. They could become slaves. They didn't want that. It's a fundamental structure that's always been there. So the form, I also mentioned, the form democracy took in America was white supremacist, providing, as Du Bois said, white workers with at least a psychological wage and a very important duty, which was helping to manage and suppress colors, which was always taken very seriously in America. Movements to unite the two classes of workers, the two proletariats, have always met with strong counter movements. The Civil War and Reconstruction was met with a counter-revolution. And I would add that the radical abolitionists who really brought on the Civil War, when they passed the 13th and 14th Amendments, if you go back and read their discourse, they were aiming for much more than just the end of chattel slavery. The 13th Amendment was intended to end not only chattel slavery, but work that resembles slavery. It was really an effort to create a new kind of economy that could bring workers together fundamentally. That was understood at the time, and the reaction that brought upon was terror. Blacks couldn't vote for 100 years after that. It was a genuine counter-revolution. The reaction to populism, which came at the end of the 1800s, started bringing poor white farmers and blacks together, was met with federal legal racial segregation. And the civil rights movement in the 1950s was very clearly aiming at bringing the two proletariats together. If you read Martin Luther King's speeches before labor federations, you hear it very clearly. That if you bring white workers and colored workers together, you can make America a Swedish social democracy or anything else you want, because you will have that much power. And the reaction to that was also very strong, and Nixon's silent majority, etc., so strong that rather than integrate the social welfare program, social welfare state, the right decided to destroy it altogether. So you have the crazy thing of Nixon, who's president of the United States, saying, the federal bureaucracy and the Supreme Court are hemming me in, even though he's the president. You have Reagan saying the best government is no government, even though he's the president. You have presidents actually campaigning against government. And that was rather than really integrate, which posed the threat of uniting this potentially really powerful force. So I talk about that, and I argue that in the United States, this structural differentiation between the two proletariats has been recreated over and over again. sometimes, often with the support of liberals. And, you know, Bloomberg, 6 million African Americans, Latinos stopped and frisked. Really police state in Black and Latino communities. A lot of liberals supported that. Mass incarceration, Clinton doubled down on that, etc. Eve was talking about looking at health, mentioned health. Black health outcomes in America are about the same as Iraq and El Salvador. Those are two war-torn countries. To give you an example of how deep these differences and disparities are, there really is a structural difference between colored and white, and look who's being rounded up and deported and harassed right now. So, in a democracy, keeping the two proletariats separate is the key to conservative power. However, now, the colored proletariat in a couple decades will be a majority. In elementary school, children of color are already a majority. And I suggest that's an existential threat to white power, white identity, that Trump really appealed to. So anyway, there's a lot more to be said on that, but I wanted to mention that. Third, I'm at MIT. I spend a lot of time with engineers. Oh, okay. I spend a lot of time with engineers. Third part of the paper is about the disruptive effects of the digital economy. I could have added the green emergence of environmentalism and what needs to happen in order to save the planet. And it's extremely disruptive. And it's going to force, in my belief and opinion, it's really pointing beyond capitalism. It already is, technology already has been disruptive. It's the main cause of job loss in America in recent decades, not trade. It's mainly been technology. But what's coming is way beyond that. The Internet of Things, artificial intelligence, open source software, those things are transformative. Soon 1 billion people will be able to collaborate in real time on a problem, in real time. Open source, there's never been a force that productive in history. Most of your supercomputers and mainframes and IBM and Apple and all of them use Linux. Linux was created open source. Hundreds and thousands of engineers and others collaborating on the internet to create something, and it's free. And there's just never been that kind of force. And it introduces new kinds of problems, which is how do you pay people? When you're creating something that's unbelievably productive, but everyone's kind of contributing here and there, and you can't really measure everyone's contribution. It's kind of like professors, right? What's your lecture worth? $33, $35, $41.50? How do you measure that? You can't. And so it introduces the notion of social in a profound way, and more and more the economy is going to be driven in that kind of direction. Another problem is when we have machines doing more and more of the work, Walmart is introducing robots to stock shelves. There are going to be big layoffs there. Other big boxes will do the same. Under capitalism, the way we structure it, you need to have a job in order to access goods in stores, in order to have a wage. Particularly as we don't have a basic income in this country and many other things. So what are we going to do? Even though the productivity is immense, people can't access it. These kinds of things are challenges. Lastly, I talk about the future, which I'm actually somewhat optimistic about, despite what I just said. I think what's going on in cities right now in the United States is encouraging. A majority of cities in America, 80% of large cities are majority Black, Latino, Asian. If you add young white people who've been voting for progressively in progressive directions quite consistently, 80% voted for Obama twice. If you put those together with people of color, that's a big majority coming across in cities around the country. I worked on de Blasio's 2 campaigns. Very deliberately, we focused on building up that kind of coalition. De Blasio won by 50 points first time, 40 points second time. Never happened before. In Birmingham, Alabama, in Tallahassee, in San Antonio, you're in Salt Lake City, you're beginning to see these kinds of coalitions coming together, and I think it can sweep the country. And two other points I want to make. Bringing these coalitions together involves all the things that Eve was talking about. In my opinion, liberalism has very little to say on how to address race, how to address the fundamental kind of group identities that exist in this country. And most white Americans are not even aware that they are white Americans. They don't even recognize themselves as a culture and a group. Two quick examples. The AFL-CIO headquarters in Washington, D.C. has murals on the wall depicting the history of the labor movement. It starts with a strike in Lawrence, Massachusetts, really beautiful thing, women and children in 1912. And every time I go there, I say, how come Harriet Tubman's, you don't have a mural of Harriet Tubman? Do you not regard millions of slaves fighting for their liberation who worked for 250 years for no wage as not a labor movement? They don't. They don't even see how white and male they are. Can't see it. And, you know, we call, a lot of political scientists call the founders, people who signed the Declaration of Independence, founding fathers. The only time I saw my grandfather cry, except when my grandmother died, was when he sat me down to tell me stories that were passed down to him from his uncles and aunts about rape under slavery. He cried. We all cried. Calling rapists who bred black women like cattle founding fathers is deeply offensive. Deeply offensive. Most white Americans have no idea when they use that language it's even offensive. You know, the issues and problems that we have to dig into in order to really begin to come together are profound. And I just think that's new work we have to do. But I think we can do it. I also think big data and the internet and all those things can offer opportunities for us to build new forms of economic power, new forms of political power that were not possible or imaginable in the past. And I don't have time to go into it, but I'm actually working with a bunch of unions in a couple of cities to develop these models, and it's really promising. I really think now is the time for us to build new kinds of political and economic institutions. Thank you.
Next, our final speaker, Ian Shapiro, is Sterling Professor of Political Science at Yale. He's also the Henry R. Luce Director of the Macmillan Center for International and Area Studies. He's known primarily for his writings on democracy and the method of social inquiry. And his most recent book is Politics Against Domination, which came out in 2016 with Harvard University Press. Ian.
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for coming. Thanks for having us here. This book I'm writing with Francis, which we've circulated some chapters from, I think has the character that there's probably something in it to annoy everybody in this room. So I'll try and keep the time so that people will have the opportunity to express their annoyance. The motivation for the book is a paradox that has already been alluded to by a number of people in their presentation. But the paradox, as we try to put it, is that moves to bring democracy closer to the people since the 1960s have been accompanied by unprecedented levels of voter alienation from politics. Now, there are plenty of reasons for that have been alluded to. Rise in inequality, unpopular wars that have largely just worsened our position in the world while alienating more and more voters. Many other changes in the world that have produced that alienation, but nonetheless, we argue that these things are importantly related. That the effort to
disagree, start a disagreement here. The effort to democratize democracy has been counterproductive, that it has actually increased alienation. And our positive thesis is that two big, strong political parties competing over programmatic outcomes is actually best for democracy. And so what do I mean when I say that efforts to democratize democracy, they basically weaken political parties and leaders. We've got increasing attention paid and consequences flowing from primaries and caucuses. We have majority-minority districts, which again, another attempt to democratize political parties by getting better descriptive representation, emphasis on deliberation and other forms of direct participation, direct election of party leaders, ballot initiatives, referenda, plebiscites. These are all efforts to take democratic decisions away from political parties. Preference for PR in European systems or on European models, again, to get better representation within parliaments. Fixed parliaments, term limits, these in various countries, in various systems, have all weakened political parties, and we think that that is a bad thing. Our basic argument, encapsulated in the subtitle, is that the good is really two strong parties that alternate in government over programmatic agendas. The bad is multiple parties and coalition governments, which tend to produce clientelist competition, which we'll talk a little bit more about. And the ugly is various forms of hybrid of those things that turn out badly, but produce weak parties, fragmented and intra-party competition. So if you wanted to put it all into a slide, we like big and strong, which was the UK before they started messing it up in the last couple of decades. Small, strong, you tend to get Northern Europe. Big, weak is the United States. We have very weak but very big parties. And then small, weak is where you have some things like open list PR or systems like in Israel, where you have both small parties and primaries. So you get the worst of all worlds. So you're most likely to get programmatic competition when you have big, strong parties. You'll get wholesale clientelism when you have small, strong parties. You'll get retail clientelism when you have weak parties. And so you can get the worst of both if you put your mind to it. What we're really trying to maximize is competition over programmatic policies, bundling, and the long run. So let me say a little bit about each of those. Programmatic policies are policies that are conceived of as good for the country as a whole, from a partisan point of view. Of course, parties have different views of that. They have to bundle in order to create those policies. They have to, and why bundling is important, and I think this is partly what Chris was alluding to in his reference to our paper. But if you have to bundle a lot of policies, you have to discount everything you affirm by everything else you affirm. Whereas if you pull one issue out for a referendum, let's say, then you don't have to discount it by the other things you affirm. And you can have Proposition 13, say, in California, just to cut taxes to 1% of assessed values, and you don't have to think about the costs of that. Or you can whatever it is you like, you can legalize marijuana and not think about the opportunity costs of that with respect to everything else you do. So we think that having parties have to bundle before elections is actually a good thing, because they then have to come up with broad programs that can be affirmed in the long run. The long run is important as well, because parties need to build allegiance over time and to be held accountable over time for the policies that they advocate. So just to put a little flesh on this, some people say, people like Bing Powell and Larry Bartels in an earlier iteration. Some people say, well, all of this differentiation between two parties and multi-party systems is overstated because, after all, two parties make the coalition before the election and multi-party systems make the coalition after. But let me just say, let's think about the difference between in industrial negotiations, last best offer arbitration versus arbitration where arbitrators have to just split the difference. So, for example, if business and labor are negotiating, they're both going to take a position. They go to the arbitrator, and the arbitrator will do some fact-finding and then probably split the difference in some way, shape, or form. This gives the parties incentives to take extreme positions because at the end of the day there's going to be some compromise, and they want to have laid out an extreme position from which to compromise, right? But there's another kind of arbitration called last best offer arbitration, where both sides make their offer and the arbitrator has to pick one. Can't say, oh, I'll split the difference or go. It has to pick one. That creates an incentive not to misrepresent. It creates an incentive to articulate a position that they think a reasonable person would prefer. And because otherwise the arbitrator is going to pick the other side's point of view. So one of the arguments we make is that when you have two big parties and they know that if they don't win the election, the other party will win the election, they really have a much bigger incentive to behave like parties in industrial negotiations behave when there's last best offer arbitration than when there is just straightforward arbitration, where they have strong incentives to misrepresent their views strategically in order to maximize the positions from which they can turn out. Another way of thinking about this is coalitions that are made before the fact, so big political parties that can persist over time, are more like marriages, in that marriages are, of course, people sometimes get divorced, but people don't get married in anticipating they're going to get divorced. They marry thinking they're putting together an alliance for a very long time. And that's more like what you get when you have two big parties that are persisting over time. You know you're going to be who you're going to be competing with in the future. You want to sustain the relationship. And so what you're going to do is internalize the costs of the deals that you have to make in order to hold the coalition together. When we think of multi-party systems, you don't know who you're going to be in a coalition with. And even when you form the coalition after the election, it's like a hookup in the sense you have no reason to believe that at the next election you're going to have the same coalition. You might have some different coalition. And so when you campaign in multi-party systems, all you want to do is turn out your base and get yourself into the biggest strategic position that you can, rather than think about internalizing the costs of your coalition, of your deals. Rather, you're going to externalize them onto third parties. So you might have, a coalition of, say, consumers and farmers, or workers, or business and farmers who will make a coalition that externalize the costs of their deal onto consumers. So all of which is to say, it's not really true that there's no difference between the implicit coalitions made before the fact in big parties and the explicit coalitions made after the fact with small parties. So I'll just skip over. There's some, I think it's worth paying some attention to this. But we think much too little attention is being paid to the nature of political parties and their role in political systems. Burke called a party a body of men. In those days it was, united for promoting their joint endeavors. By their joint endeavors, the national interest upon some particular principle in which they're all agreed. Schacht-Snyder, again, said modern democracy is unthinkable, save in terms of parties. As a matter of fact, the condition of the parties is the best possible evidence for the nature of any regime. And since this is a political theory conference, appropriate, I think, to talk about Arendt, who in The Origins of Totalitarianism gave a very powerful summary of the spirit of what we're trying to say here, which is that in a two-party system, one party always represents the government and actually runs the country, so that temporarily the party in power becomes identical with the state. Since the rule of each party is limited in time, the opposition party exerts control whose efficiency is strengthened by the certainty that it is the ruler tomorrow. The multi-party system never allows any one man or party or any one party to assume full responsibility, with the natural consequence that no government formed by party alliances ever feels fully responsible. Since the rise of party systems, it's been a matter of course to identify parties with particular interests, economic and others, and all continental parties, not only their labor groups, have been very frank in admitting this. The Anglo-Saxon party, on the other hand, founded on some particular principle for the service of national interest, is itself the actual or future state of the country. Particular interests are represented in the party itself at its right and left wing and held in check by the very necessities of government. So this is, I think, encapsulates as long ago as 1951 what we mean by programmatic competition, that we think we should be moving toward, but in fact we have been moving away from in many countries over many decades. So reform agendas are hard because of the misdiagnosis. They're hard because of the beneficiaries of the status quo are unlikely to want to change it. They're hard because starry-eyed progressive agendas get hijacked by the people who benefit from weak and decentralized parties. They're hard because of the misguided faith in PR, and they're hard because the direction that reform needs to take is the opposite of what most people think, which is why we're writing our book. Thank you very much.
Our next, our first commentator is Jacob Hacker, who I know very, very well, and I'm not finding his bio here. He's an endowed professor of political science at Yale University and the director of the ISPS, and leading scholar and public intellectual on American politics and governance.
Pretty good, but I'm not. Thank you. You'd forgotten that I am also someone who knows almost nothing about democratic theory, which may raise the question of why I'm here today. But like Chris, I'd like to think that studying American politics gives us some insight into political dysfunction. And therefore, I'm going to feel free to take my localized knowledge and generalize it a bit in responding to these really excellent papers. So I, of course, want to issue the standard thanks to everyone involved with organizing and being part of this conference, including you. I want to thank David and Mia in particular for so efficiently handling the very difficult job of getting me to this conference from down the street. And I want to just put in a plug for the Institution for Social and Policy Studies, which I do direct. And one thing to say is that ISPS goes back to the time that Robert Dahl and Charles Lindblom, who one of whom passed away recently and the other of whom is amazingly still vibrant. The two of them were here at Yale thinking about modern democracies, and Dahl's Who Governs, written about New Haven in the 1950s, it was published in '61, I think is actually a pretty acute work of political theory as well as empirical political science. So I take some inspiration from the idea that you can study American politics and say something about American and democracy writ large. So
These papers disagree with each other quite a bit, as you've already seen, and so one temptation I have is sort of to get out of the way and let the authors go at it. But I will just try to draw out a few points of convergence and divergence under three broad headings. The first heading is a question whether we're talking about a crisis of or a crisis in democracy. The second heading is the place of the social question in our thinking about this putative crisis. And the third topic is about the role of race and I guess ethnicity, but race has really been the key focus in the conversation so far. Okay, so crisis of democracy or in democracy. How do we understand the difference between the two? Well, I think the question that we have to ask and is raised well, I think, in the differing perspectives between Eve and Philip on the one hand, and Francis and Ian and Chris on the other hand, is whether or not we have a problem, and I would say Chris, of course, is the most sanguine, not because he thinks that things are working particularly well, but he thinks that things not working particularly well is kind of the normal order of democracy. A realist view of democracy is actually a title that E.E. Schachtschneider used. And I think it is worth noting that Schachtschneider's realist view was quite a bit more idealistic in some ways than yours, and led towards a kind of party-centered view of the sort that Ian and Francis present. But in any case, there's some pretty big differences between these, and I think they do come down to whether or not we're talking about representative democracy not living up to its potential, or the problem being that our vision of democracy is too cramped. So I won't say anything more because this is definitely outside of my it's above my pay grade, or maybe since it's a theorist problem, it's below my pay grade. But I will say that I do think that in the United States we're facing a slow-moving constitutional crisis, and that is not to discount in any way what Chris is saying about how our system normally works. I think the three things that I would highlight, one is the fundamental lack of responsiveness of the system, and that's in part because it's just so hard to get it to do anything. The second is my concern about the breakdown of American checks and balances, particularly acute today, which may raise questions about whether checks and balances as constituted in the kind of Madisonian framework are the right way to respond to the problems of executive aggrandizement in particular. And I would ask, I'm curious to get Ian's thoughts about the role of the presidency in their model, given that I think what their vision is a parliamentary system with a prime minister being the leader of the dominant party. The third problem I'll just raise here is I think it's just that we tend to forget that one of the roots of the problem of our system, rooted in first past the post plurality single member districts, is that it's not very good at dealing with spatial polarization, both of the economic and political sort. And I'll come back to that theme. But I think it's a problem that actually Francis and Ian should grapple with a bit in thinking about the structure of elections. So it's not so much a problem of whether PR or not PR, but whether or not people represent particular places and the character of those places. Okay. So what about the second thing I raised, the place of the social question? I thought it was Shapiro who said the uncoupling of political and economic liberalism is a fundamental question of the day. I've written a lot about the stark rise in inequality in the United States, and I think it raises this question of to what extent a well-functioning democracy is premised upon a kind of positive sum economy. One that makes, as I like to quote George W. Bush here, and I rarely quote him, one that makes the pie higher. So that everyone gets the benefit. And I thought Eve was right to emphasize that in the United States, we're talking about a huge crisis, not just of economic inequality, but of unprecedented in historical and comparative relief wage stagnation, as well as we are the first country in the modern era with absent some kind of epidemic or collapse, regime collapse, to see rising death rates among portions of the population, in this case among middle-class white Americans, as Angus Deaton and Ann Case have pointed out. So The easy answer, I think, and the one that's implied to some extent in Ian and Francis's reply, is that, well, democracy, when it's done right, will produce positive sum economic outcomes. I'm not so sure. And I think they're right to raise the power. The outsized power of mobile capital is one constraint. I think that both Eve and Phillip are right to raise the specter of artificial intelligence and automation. And I would only say that Phillip threw out the idea, well, we don't have a universal basic income. There is a group of people who are pushing for a universal basic income. They're in Silicon Valley, and they're billionaires. And we should step back and ask whether or not we think that they have the right motives in this particular aspiration. And if, as I believe, that that's neither a feasible nor desirable solution, what kind of social settlement do we need to create a somewhat secure foundation for American democracy and democracy in general in the future? Okay, finally, race. So this is lurking behind all of them, all of the papers. It's most explicit in Thompson, even more explicit in his talk. And I thought Chris would put it well when he said at the start that politics is fundamentally about groups and group competition. I will say that I think that in general, there's a tendency to not think so much about what the Tocqueville called intermediate organizations in thinking about the pros and cons of different kinds of democratization. I think that in particular, Ian and Francis's remedy really rests on a strong set of intermediate organizations that represent social interest, and that should be articulated, and perhaps it is articulated more clearly elsewhere in the book. But what I will say is that group identities, race in particular, and race is more than just that, and particularly in the American context, raise these two problems that John Romer has nicely distinguished between what he called the solidarity effect and the bundling effect, right? So the solidarity effect is the I don't want to share with people who don't look like me, and the bundling effect is I want to vote for candidates on the basis of their appealing to my identity, particularly my racism, and don't care as much about what they do for me economically. And though you could call one problem the George Wallace problem, bundling problem, and the other solidarity problem, the problem of America's weak welfare state. And I have to say that to me, this is the most difficult problem raised by Trump's rise. It is, to me, something that does represent, if not a departure, an intensification of trends, and certainly a pushback against the idea that we're moving inexorably towards a society in which these kinds of divisions are not dangerous to both solidarity and fair democratic electoral competition. So I don't have an obvious answer to this problem, and I will just say that I think that Francis and Ian nicely go through the troubled history of race in American party politics, and they present the 1960s, the openness of this brief moment after African Americans are brought into the polity in a real way, as this kind of brief but eclipsed moment of possibility. And if you believe that, then the democratic, or putatively democratic reforms that followed that made the Democratic Party more responsive to identity politics and special interest was the kind of breaking down, was the kind of threat to that order. And I'm skeptical. I think that the kind of sorting that I was talking about, particularly between the parties on the basis of race and place, was much more hardwired into the system, and that most kinds of political reforms would not have prevented it, which leaves us with that difficult question. So in an age in which the location of people matters not just for their prosperity, but also for their political clout, we've seen a divorce between the sources of political advantage and the sources of economic advantage. Urban areas are becoming the hub of innovation and growth in the knowledge economy. They are also the places where Democratic voters are crammed together, making it quite easy to draw districts that have overwhelming Democratic margins. Meanwhile, rural and ex-urban areas are increasingly conservative, rural, and powerful because of the nature of our system. Not just the 2 senators per state rule, but also the fact that it is in a single member plurality system so easy to draw districts in ways that magnify your control over politics when you have lots of people who are broadly distributed rather than concentrated across territories. So how do we address that? It seems to me that's the key to the problem. And what we have today in Trump's plutocratic populism is a effective coalition of the economically weak but politically advantaged and the economically advantaged and politically strong who in corporate America and the top 0.1%, and to them, Donald J. Trump says, let them eat tweets. Thanks.
I just want to reassure you there will be a break. We'll have one more discussion and then we'll take a break and then we'll reconvene for an open conversation.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Helen. Thank you, Shayla, and David and Mia. And I'm mindful that we have not only paper presenters who really disagree with each other rather strongly, and lots of folks out there who are going to have great questions, and we have a bathroom waiting and maybe refreshments, so I am not going to say very much. I'm going to be very brief. So the current sort of situation, shall we say, in the United States and in other parts of the world, the election of Donald Trump, the victory of the Leave side in Brexit, and in the rise of far-right parties in parts of Europe that we thought would be free of such parties, and so on and so forth, brings out a lot of different reactions among academics. And I'm admiring of a reaction that I see in Eve, which is a kind of, this is not working, let's experiment with some really new things. And I think I got a bit of that from the other, from Ian and Francis, and, from the other presentations as well, to some degree also in Phil's presentation, the optimism that he senses, especially when he looks at the nature of city governments and movements in cities across the country, including in very red parts of the country. My own reaction, and I think this comes from my identity as a Latin Americanist, is to kind of hold my breath and hope that our institutions, as they are, problematic as they are, don't collapse entirely. The image that comes to my mind these days is we're sort of we're on a small kind of leaky sailboat going into a terrible storm that has Trump written all over it. And our institutions, which is sort of the mast and the sails, are being subjected to tremendous pressure and tension, and we're just holding our breaths hoping that we come out on the other side not completely destroyed. Because being destroyed in the experience of fellow countries in our hemisphere means, there's no ambiguity. They're run by people who wear uniforms, and people knock on citizens' doors in the middle of the night and take them away, and they're never seen again, and so on and so forth. And so I have a kind of, I guess, sort of a conservative or cautious reaction to the current situation, and I also really are insistent on being quite precise about where we are and what the nature of the crisis is. And I'm cautious about jumping to the conclusion that democracy itself is being proved to be an inadequate system, that so-called liberal democracy with kind of some of the institutions that we're familiar with that of course vary a lot from democracy to democracy, have been proven to be inadequate because we have some really bad outcomes. On the contrary, my feeling is let's cling to them like we're clinging to that mast in the storm and hope that we come out okay on the other side, and then and can continue not to be complacent about the institutions we have, but to try to improve them and strengthen them. So I wanted to start by having just a few comments on the Rosenbluth and Shapiro chapters, which I really enjoyed reading, and I want to say that Ian Shapiro is a very wise man and a friend, and somebody who, one of the wise things that he often says is, scholarship or the book or an article, it's sort of like people, there are good things about it and bad things about it, and it's kind of a mix, and you try to bring out the good and so on. I feel like they forgot that lesson a little bit with these chapters. I feel like maybe for the purpose of shaking us up and trying to really get our attention, they are pretending that the kinds of institutions that they favor, so sort of two-party old Westminster style political systems, are uniformly good, and all the things that look to them like excessive democratization of political systems have uniformly bad effects. And so we should jettison, if we could, we should jettison those other systems like proportional representation systems, which tend to lead to multipartism, and increasing direct citizen participation in the selection of candidates, and referendums, and so on and so forth. Throw it all out. It's all wrong. I want him to remember that that all political institutions in democracies involve trade-offs, and we really want to think hard about what we gain and what we lose, and maybe on balance we would prefer to have the kind of system that they're yearning for in this book. I actually don't think that they've made a clear case that we want that, but I think that the method of analysis of getting there needs to be more attuned to trade-offs. So the master narrative of the chapters is that political systems around the world have embraced internal democratization of various forms, and doing so has reduced the ability of governments to carry out good public policy. The normative message is that polities should revert or reform their way toward two-party systems with centralized parties on the Westminster model, not the watered-down Westminster model of devolved regions and decentralization, but the model as it operated sort of through the mid-20th century. Now, you may be wondering what the connection is between a two-party system and centralization, internal centralization or hierarchical quality of political parties. And I confess that I'm wondering that too. There are sort of two parts to the argument as I read it. Francis and Ian link proportional representation in mixed member parliaments with multipartyism. So far so good. That's a fairly established observable fact. And multipartyism with two outcomes: decentralized political parties and decentralized legislative or governing processes. Now, the first claim, I think, is just not right. Political parties in multi-party systems can be centralized or decentralized, as can parties in two-party systems. Parties in multi-party systems can tightly control candidate selection procedures. They can impose programmatic discipline on legislators. They can coordinate campaign efforts and messages. And parties in two-party systems may lack these same capacities, depending on a whole bunch of factors. There are, of course, very striking differences between Westminster-style and two-party systems and proportional multi-party systems. At the top of the list, as Francis and Ian note, is the greater frequency of post-electoral coalition governments in multi-party systems. They concur with experts like Ming Howell, whom Ian mentioned, that post-electoral coalition governments are less easy to hold to account than their polar opposite, single-party governments. Though not everyone agrees that, the single-party governments are easier to hold to account. Not everybody agrees with that. So Chris Anderson, for instance, finds that European voters are pretty good at discerning which party has which portfolios in elections. But Bing and Francis and Ian are focusing on the fact that you do get many more coalition governments in multi-party systems. But contrary to Powell, accountability, which is favored by single-party governments, isn't Ian and Francis's main concern. It's the quality and efficiency of public policy. Their claim is that single-party governments in two-party systems are superior in this regard, but I'm not entirely persuaded that that's true. I just think that the anecdotal evidence that you put forth isn't entirely persuasive. All institutions in democracies, as I said before, have sort of pluses and minuses. And my complaint about these chapters is that they don't do enough to consider the trade-offs involved. I think so they largely ignore scholarship that extols the virtues of proportional systems, which is very large. And here again, I think Bing Powell's work is, especially his book, his important book, Elections as Instruments of Democracy, is really an important counter-argument. So there Powell is interested in the kind of different ways, the different objectives of proportional and majoritarian systems in terms of the nature of representation. And in fact, he finds that proportional systems do better both in their own terms and in the terms of majority systems. So a very powerful argument in favor of PR systems, which may or may not be right, but certainly have to be considered. So, it's going to be an important and provocative book, but I'm suggesting that going back to that kind of pluses and minuses, trade-offs framework might be more effective. Let me just say a couple words about the Achen and Bartel's afterword, which Chris circulated. So this is the afterword to their important and provocative book. Probably most of you here, like Hélène, have read, maybe taught the book at this point. The afterword, as he explains, reflects on the 2016 presidential election in the US and finds that it confirms their group theory of democracy. So that view is that voters' choices are driven by their identities and not by their public policy preferences, and also not by retrospective appraisals of incumbent performance, at least in any kind of sensible way. So this is the shark attacks and bad weather part of the argument, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. So they write that American voters in 2016, as in every election, evinced a relative lack of interest in the candidates' policy proposals. This was not unusual, they contend, and I'm quoting, "Every election is more about social, ethnic, racial, occupational, religious, and partisan identities." So there was an APSA panel about the book in 2016 in which I participated, and in which Chris and Larry received much adulation and quite a bit of flack. And I think the kind of general agreement in that panel, which I'm sure Chris was persuaded of, was that the group theory part of the book was weaker or less fully fleshed out than the earlier kind of critique of rationalist approaches to democracy part of the book. Our fellow panelist, Eric Schickler, was quite passionate in his objection to the notion that in the sort of context of African American history and the adhesion of an African American vote to the Democratic Party and the role of African Americans currently in the Democratic Party, that was kind of well understood or encapsulated in terms of identity politics of a kind of tribal sort, that we have identities and they drive our party affiliations, although party affiliations themselves are a kind of identity, and that has really nothing to do with policy evaluations. And I hope I'm not creating a straw man here, but I think that the kind of a perspective that we collectively were pushing them toward was that certainly groups and identities are important in electoral politics, but group identities are forged in part in response to the policy actions and strategies of elites and of parties, and they can become sort of historically frozen. That is, African Americans are drawn to the Democratic Party after the advancement of civil rights laws in the 1960s, and there's a kind of freezing of that attachment, but perhaps it's also reinforced by some sense of the superiority of the Democrats as a kind of policy vehicle vis-a-vis in comparison to Republicans. So in other words, that there's nothing wrong with the notion that identities and group identities are important in electoral politics, but to kind of strip away any kind of sense that there's a kind of policy content to the forging of those identities is not entirely persuasive. I'm just going to say one word about referendums, which appeared in Chris's paper and in Ian and Francis's book. So the idea, so Chris and Larry write that British voters kind of showed that they were insensitive to economic issues, which presumably in a rationalist model would drive our political choices by voting in a majority for the lead position. I think that's just not right, actually, that there was a kind of fight between kind of xenophobia and concern, fear, anxiety about immigration and about refugees and about the loss of economic opportunities, very much like the kinds of themes that the Trump campaign played on here, versus a kind of a set of ideas about the advantages of the economic advantages to remaining in the EU. Those were not crazy things for the country to be arguing about, and they were very much policy-related positions. So I promise not to say much. I found Eve's paper and Phil's paper and comments extremely interesting. I sort of foreshadowed a little bit of what I wanted to say about in response to them in my opening remarks. Let me just say, maybe as a closing comment, that I understood Eve's diagnosis of the crisis of democracy to be that that democratic forms are no longer appropriate for the kinds of societies that we find ourselves living in a kind of globalized and neoliberal or post-neoliberal world. I think that I heard from Phil an account that traces the crisis to perennial conflicts as well as growing inequalities, income inequalities, and conflict over material power, resources, and needs, or the kind of response to needs that where the losers are losing and growing in number, and that diagnosis I find more persuasive, and I wanted to just sort of again put my sort of Latin Americanist hat on and disagree a bit with Eve's notion that around the world, including in the global South, the experience of the last decades has been universally one of that demonstrates the sort of corruption or hollowness of democratic forms, which the people are kind of increasingly unhappy with and rejecting. I think our experience in Latin America in the last decades has, in some sense, been a slightly happier experience than that says. And of course, if you read the newspaper, you'll be very aware of the kind of complete tanking of Venezuela on every possible dimension, which is a very sad story. And you'll be aware that just yesterday, the former president of Brazil was told that he would not, that he indeed was guilty of corruption and wouldn't be able to run again, and that opens the way for a kind of Brazilian Trump on steroids, and none of that is good news. On the other hand, it is good news that the rule of law is being upheld. It is good news that the anti-corruption scandals or prosecutions, which are reaching into many other countries out of Brazil, are effective and being carried out by very energetic and skilled prosecutors. And we have had now, 15 years of governance in most of the continent of political parties that for shorthand get called the left, which basically means that they have strong connections to organized labor as well as informal sector workers. And there have been some good things to come out of that and some bad things to come out of that. But one of the good things to come out of it is a decrease in income inequality for the first time, I think, since data have been collected, and probably for the first time ever, a sustained decrease in income inequality in the world's most unequal region. So I think we just need to be careful about whether we're in a crisis, what the nature of the crisis is, how widespread it is, what the appropriate responses are, and I found these papers extremely stimulating in beginning to answer those questions. Thank you.
well-deserved break, and we are going to take about 10 to 15 minutes tops, and reconvene afterwards for our conversation. Thank you.
Don't worry about it.
It's been really great to see her leave.
Wonderful. How old is she?
She's 6. She's in the kindergarten. She had nice taekwondo. She attends swimming classes.
6 years since we last had dinner.
Yep. So with your permission, let me leave my account. We just appeared in Sweden. In your mailbox.
Of course, with pleasure. With pleasure. With pleasure.
Thank you very much.
With pleasure. And I'll have something for you, at some other point.
Thank you very much. My congratulations on the conference. I really enjoyed it.